Hello to our listeners. I'm used to starting off this podcast every 2 weeks by welcoming Danny Ayalon. I now have the pleasure of welcoming Benjamin Anthony, who, at least for the meantime, will be taking Danny's spot. Let me first of all wish Danny the very best. It was great working for him for the year and a quarter that we did the podcast together. He will be doing other and taking other and greater initiatives, and he was a great partner, and I wish him all well. And now again, let me welcome Benjamin Anthony, who has actually been the host of this podcast together with his co-chair, Rosita Pnini, since we started, but will now be my partner. And Benjamin is a man of great accomplishment. He's also a good friend, and he has been fighting Israel's battles in the court of public opinion for many years. He is the co-chair of the Miryam Institute, which does a variety of wonderful things, other than just being a think tank when producing policy papers. One of its truly important and remarkable programs is cooperation with West Point and some of the other American and other military academies, and bringing delegations of military officers and military cadets to Israel a few times a year. Benjamin, great to welcome you now on a at least somewhat more ongoing basis.
Thank you very much for having me, Chuck. I appreciate your kind words. They're noted, though disputed about me, but I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly about your former dance partner, Ambassador Danny Ayalon. He's one of the most eloquent individuals that I've ever had the pleasure of hearing from. I think that anybody who listens to him cannot help but learn from him. I know that's certainly the case with me, and he will remain very involved with the Miryam Institute. He will continue to be one of our publishing experts and one of our writers and speakers and lecturers and debaters. You and he have even faced off in debates in the past about which US presidential ticket is best for the Israel-US relationship. You'll recall, people can go back in the archives of the Miryam Institute podcast and see all of that. He made a great fist of his argument, as I would expect. And I'm sorry that he's not continuing as your regular interlocutor here on the IDDF podcast, but I know he'll be back on this show as well from time to time. And thank you for your kind words about the Miryam Institute as well. Much appreciated. And I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with you, Chuck. And I do just want the listeners to know a little bit about you, actually, if you don't mind me just bringing to their attention something of who you are. You are an adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University, as well as Tel Aviv University, a former deputy national security advisor in Israel, ladies and gentlemen. Chuck speaks like a New Yorker, but he was actually a deputy national security advisor in Israel. And he was a long-time senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and has taught political science at Harvard, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. And as though that isn't enough, Chuck, as though that isn't enough, with a similar level of anticipation as was exhibited by the children of Israel as they awaited Moses' descent from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, there is now another book out that you have authored. Tell us about that.
Well, I think I might say that there's just a tad less anticipation, not much, but a little bit. It's a new book entitled "Israel and the Cyber Threat: How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power." And I think the title does give a pretty good idea of the substance, but it's about an amazing story about how a country of 9.5 million people, just like that city that you mentioned before, whose accent I retain, a similar population, how Israel became a global cyber power. It's a remarkable story.
It's a remarkable story, and I know that I, at least, will say in my name as I was awaiting this, because I know that it was a long, drawn-out process. This is not something that's accomplished with ease at all. It's very, very painstakingly time-consuming. I did almost revert to fashioning a golden calf as I awaited the production of this book, its publication. I resisted in the end, but I was so looking forward to it and so disappointed with the continued delays that I did think about melting down the little goal that I had into something of a cough that ultimately was averted. So thank you for sparing me the ignominy of becoming an idol worshipper, and I'm looking forward to reading that and to hopefully interviewing you a little bit about that as well. I know many people will want to do so. I hope you'll give me the opportunity to be among their number.
With pleasure.
So why don't we begin with our conversation today? And I'd be grateful if you would take the lead, Chuck.
Okay, let's start off with a topic which I believe we have to address, the whole issue of the judicial reform, or some, myself included, would prefer to call it a judicial wrecking ball. But the whole controversy in Israel about the issue of judicial reform, which is reaching or has reached this week another crisis point. I have talked about this extensively with Danny. I believe that it is the number one national security we face today. And unfortunately, it is eclipsing, and this is not good, our attention on the Iranian issue, Hezbollah, other critical issues. Our enemies believe, I think not incorrectly, that this has weakened us because we are so preoccupied with this domestic crisis, and it's one which is basically self-inflicted. Half a year ago, no one in Israel was talking about any need for judicial reform. If anything, people were just talking about the fact that the judicial processes take too long. That's certainly true. And so more judges had to be appointed. And maybe one can make the argument that some other changes were needed. I don't think there's any system that cannot be improved. But what's happened here is, whether you support the process or not, the result is, as I said, on the one hand, our attention is being deflected from more important issues, but the other point is that we are tearing ourselves apart. Israeli society is really being rented at the seams, and the IDF and the defense establishment are in danger of coming apart. Let me start with that if you want to respond now.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit first and foremost about where my position is with regard to the Israeli defense establishment. I must tell you that I think it is completely unacceptable that individuals who serve in specific units have announced their readiness to refuse the draft as reservists. But they have done that not as individuals, they've done that under the symbol of their given unit. So that might be under the symbol of the Air Force, for example, where we're hearing many, many statements to that effect. We're hearing it under the symbol of Shmona Matayim, the vaunted intelligence unit of the Israel Defense Forces.
Israel's equivalent to the American National Security Agency.
Thank you very much. We're hearing it from them as well. And I think that these individuals, which have now coalesced into groups, I believe that they will be remembered by history, in history, as having set a dangerous, dangerous precedent that will be emulated by their political opposites or politically minded opposites, and that will have massive ramifications when it comes to Israel's ability to defend itself by itself, as has always been a central credo of the defense establishment's doctrine and outlook. And I say that, I want to give a little bit of color to this, Chuck. I say that as somebody who is a veteran of service from 2005 to 2019. And as a veteran of service from
I wrote a note, excuse me for interrupting. I wrote a note to myself to say that I was remiss in the introduction to not note that you were a combat soldier and saw combat service.
Absolutely, and you're not remiss at all, because it's frankly a part of my life, whereas I look back upon it, I don't necessarily recognize the young fellow who was running around there in 2005 and 2006, but he was there and he did do what he did. And as somebody who served during that period of time, there were three key conflagrations that I can look at. The first was the Second Lebanon War of 2006, that I participated in as a conscript soldier. The second was Operation Pillar of Defense. That I participated in as a reservist. And the third was Operation Protective Edge, in which I participated again as a reservist. I did not participate in Cast Lead, which was 2008, 2009, but I looked on as events unfolded. And I want you to know that I completely disagreed with the ideas that underpinned Operation Pillar of Defense and Operation Protective Edge. And I also disagreed with the ideas that underpinned Cast Lead, even though it was venerated because it was seen as a return to deterrence at the time by the Israel Defense Forces, a deterrence that everybody had claimed wrongly, in my opinion, had been lost during the course of the Second Lebanon War. Now, I didn't agree with the policies of those campaigns, but I did report to the line when called. I reported to the line in 2012. I flew in from overseas, and I reported to the line in 2014. And by 2014, not only was I serving next to my brothers in arms, but I was serving next to my brothers, specifically two younger brothers, Raphael and Alexander. And all of us reported to the line, even though we did not agree with the policies at play. Now, the notion that those who are in the vaunted intelligence units of the Israel Defense Force and the vaunted Air Force of the Israeli military will now say that they will decide when to come and when not to come, I think is a grave, grave error, and I think it sets a dangerous precedent, and I don't applaud that type of decision-making. And I want to reiterate, and then I'll hand it back to you, I could stomach it. I wouldn't be enthusiastic about it, but I could stomach it were they to do so as individuals. But that's not what's happening here. They are doing so beneath the banners of their units. And of course, we don't hear from the many who serve in those same units who will continue to report to the line.
So let me say that on the one hand, I share your abhorrence of what's happening. And I agree with you that this is a dangerous precedent, because if it's legitimate here, it becomes legitimate in the future. When this first started happening in March, I must say that my reaction was of, what are they talking about? We're not going to serve? Okay, I mean, I'm an altekakil, so I mean, I don't get called up anymore. But I mean, if I was a few years younger, I think I'd be there instantaneously. And what difference does it make if I agree or not? We have a supreme commitment to the defense of the state of Israel. And of course, we've all had cases. I remember a case in my service, which was a few years earlier than your own, where I was totally upset by something that I disagreed with strongly. And I remember shaking in fury because I thought this was, and it was a major issue. I don't want to say which it was, which I disagreed with fundamentally. I thought Israel was taking very, very misguided military action. And eventually I calmed myself down by saying, Chuck Freilich, military ID number such and such, nobody gave you an illegitimate order. So shut up and carry it out.
Right, right.
Okay. Look, it's very problematic. And again, the precedent is very dangerous. There are at times, I think, calls to higher duty. The people on this side, by the way, the first few weeks when it came out, I was dead against it. And over time, my position evolved. The people who support it believe that they are serving the state of Israel, and that the battle this time isn't about policy X or policy Y, it's about our fundamental character as a democracy, that they are morally barred from serving a, I don't want to say dictatorship, because Israel won't become a dictatorship, but an illiberal democracy, a less than a full democracy. And this higher calling, this higher moral duty requires them to do what they do, even though I know that they are all torn very greatly. And I think many people who would like to join are not doing so. And those who are joining in the effort are not doing it lightly by any means. One thing that might actually make this a bit more palatable for you is that I think it's changed, and at least in the recent days, the decision seems to be, including there was a big meeting 2 days ago this week of all of the pilots, the reserve pilots, that they seem to have decided that they will do this as individuals and not as a group. But they will also be presented in the press as doing things in a group sense. They are not going to take a collective decision, and each person will make his or her own.
Well, look, my position on this started, as I've just articulated. It has not evolved over time. In fact, I've become more deeply entrenched in that position as I've seen this ensuing danger and approaching danger. And I wonder, Chuck, I wonder how leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, for example, will conjure with a repetition of the same coming from a different segment of the Israel Defense Forces in the event that he returns to becoming prime minister, that perhaps he promotes positions and policy initiatives that others dislike from among our serving men and women, and they start to refuse. I wonder if then he will assign the same degree of applause to those who say, I cannot serve, I will not serve. Not only will I not serve as an individual, but I'm not going to serve beneath the banner of my unit. I don't think it will be greeted with such enthusiasm when the shoe is on the other foot. And I think that it inevitably will come to such a situation because the precedent now has been set. Now, with regard to the judicial reform, here's where I am on this issue. First of all, I wish this issue would go away. I'm just being completely candid and completely frank with you. This is an issue which did not need to be thrust forward into the centerpiece, not only of the Israeli psyche, but actually into the focus of many of our friends and allies throughout the international community. I think that Israel might be suffering from a hangover here, where they believe that internal Israeli conversations stay internal and domestic within the state of Israel. Not true at all. At the very least, and here's where I'll talk about my own evolution on a particular position. I believed that when this proposed judicial reform was put forward by Yariv Levin, very, very quickly after he came into his position as the justice minister, following the most recent set of elections, you remember he swiftly made this announcement and outlined
Couple of weeks
and outlined the principles for this reform. I actually felt that it was just the beginning of a negotiating position. It was the outlining, if you like, of a negotiating position by the government. They would expect something to come back in opposition, and they would water it down. Now, I actually believe it was that. I don't think anybody anticipated the backlash that it then received. But I think now the government must understand, number one, this is not necessary. It simply is not necessary. Life in the state of Israel was not so intolerable and untenable because of the situation with regard to the judiciary and the composition of the Supreme Court and the selection committee of justices, that everybody was suffering, and this needed to become a national imperative. Not only that, but the judicial system in Israel shields, to go back to what we were just talking about, in many international fora, are combat soldiers when bad actors seek to bring us to trial, universal jurisdiction, The Hague, so on and so forth. And thirdly, they should just realize and understand, even if it is in need of adjustment, not reform or overhaul, but adjustment, and perhaps you and I can agree on that, right? There might be some room for adjustment. These are not the stewards of that adjustment in the eyes of a preponderance of the electorate. And therefore, they would do well to back away from it. And quite frankly, I can't quite understand why there is this massive expenditure of political capital on this issue. In fact, I was speaking about this just last night. Every country's got these third rail issues, right? In the United States, it might be immigration or gun control. It seems this is a third rail issue. Why is this government continuing to expend political capital on this issue when it is having the effect that it's having?
Well, I mean, I have my answer for that, which we may not agree on, but we do agree on two things. First of all, on the fact that this whole reform process was not necessary. And we also, just to go back for 1 minute to the previous subject, we agree that this precedent was very dangerous and will be abused in the future by everyone. And you're absolutely right that if Lapid is elected premier and something like this happens, he will probably not respond to it as favorably as he did now. I think everyone recognizes that this is a very exceptional case. And it's not just a matter of because you disagree with a policy, you can come out and oppose service, but it has to be something which is, and even then it's questionable. I accept the fact that this is a very questionable issue, but even then it has to be something that is absolutely fundamental to the state of Israel. And if you remember during the disengagement, what the IDF did to circumvent the opposition to the withdrawal that came from right-wing soldiers is that they were not asked to participate, were not ordered to participate in the withdrawal process. They were excused from it. And at the time, I also found that a problematic solution. But all right, let's go back to the judicial reform. I mean, why has this happened? I continue to believe that the primary and overwhelming reason was that Netanyahu wants to save himself from judicial peril. He does not, understandably, does not want to go to jail, and there is still a pretty good chance that that will be the outcome. And he seems to, there's the old issue about power corrupting and absolute, it's not absolute in our case, but absolute power corrupting absolutely. He's been in office for too long. And I think he's been a good man who I disagreed with on many issues, but a very good man with a illustrious career, a former member of Sayeret Matkal, the #1 combat unit, commando unit that we have, and a man who's done some good things as premier. But he's been there too long. He has come to identify himself with the state of Israel, l'État et moi, and he is willing to go to all lengths to stay in power and not to go to jail. And then there's Yariv Levin. At least to his credit, he has been talking about this apparently for 20 years now. I do not understand why a justice minister has a fundamental animus to the judicial system. I can't understand where he brings it from, because it's not that he proposed XYZ reforms and was forceful about it, but this appears to be some sort of messianic drive for him. And you see the way he talks about things and the extreme statements he makes. And at this point, it's now just become a matter of political maneuvering and political standing. Netanyahu and his partners cannot afford to lose at this point because of how they'll look to their constituencies.
Well, I'll just say a couple of points in response to that. Firstly, I'm surprised that you've emphasized Netanyahu and Yariv Levin. I'm not surprised that you've emphasized those two, but you didn't make mention of Simcha Rotman, for example. I'm sure that you think that he's a central component in all of this. In my judgment, he very much is. I just want to talk a little bit about Netanyahu so that everybody understands where I am on this situation. I find it extremely regrettable that people, I'm not saying you're doing this, Chuck, but many people are doing it, that people are foreclosing on the outcome of the Prime Minister's trials. There is absolutely no evidence one way or the other that this will culminate in him going to jail. He is having his proverbial day in court. He's entitled to that day in court.
Absolutely.
One of the cases in particular, the case to do with cigars and champagne, seems to be crumbling. And that's something that seems to be such a weak case at the moment that the justices who are presiding over the case have advised the prosecution that it will be difficult for them to get to a guilty verdict here, for them to prove guilt in this particular case.
No, to prove that it was bribery, not the other charges of improper behavior. And there's a third charge, I forget at the moment.
Fair, but it's a it seems to be in a very tenuous position. The one that bothered me much more was the case about Netanyahu influencing press coverage while he was communications minister, not so much when he was prime minister, because I think prime ministers will do that. Prime ministers will go about that, but to do it as communications minister, I think If it's proven to be the case, obviously that's unacceptable. But we don't know the outcome of that. And I think that everybody needs to stop foreclosing on the verdict of those cases. I don't think it's helpful when it comes to understanding this push for judicial reform. And frankly, I don't think it's helpful for understanding the motivations of Prime Minister Netanyahu, because I don't know that it would necessarily extricate himself from those complications, even if judicial reform was to be passed in the fashion that is currently being spoken about. The other thing is this, and I'll just throw this cat among the pigeons, if I may. The center and the left has to take responsibility for this as well. They're not blameless here. They created, by their anyone but BB attitude in repeated elections, a vacuum, a coalition vacuum, into which stepped individuals like Bezalel Smotrich. Obviously, the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties were there as well, into which steps Simcha Rotman, into which steps, you name it. We all know who these components are, who these individuals are. That could have been averted. And rather than boycott Bibi Netanyahu, what they should have said for the national good, the center and center-left parties, is, I'm going to hold my nose here and step under the stretcher, as we say, step under the stretcher so that I can carry Israel to its next incarnation over the next 4 years, and inform policy and steer policy and prevent the absolute majorities that are now being capitalized upon by this coalition. Why is no one raising the finger and pointing it at them and saying, you know what, your decision making is off, your judgment is off, and you bear some of the responsibility here?
Okay, so 2 points, and then maybe if you want to respond, we'll go on to the next issue. First of all, I think the reforms will enable him to extricate himself from the legal process, especially if this reform that went through the first reading a couple of days ago, the reasonableness criteria for Supreme Court decisions is done away with. Then it's reasonable to have a prime minister who's under indictments and who may be found guilty of some serious charges, and also it will enable all sorts of things. We can appoint as a minister, a man who has been convicted of 3 crimes and who serves in jail for a few years, who continues to, apparently, and hasn't been proven in court yet, mess around economically. His brother somehow has made millions of shekels in unclear ways. We can have people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir in the government. That's also reasonable. And then they will, if not now, then in a couple of months, they will succeed in stacking the Judicial Appointment Committee. They will change how the justices are appointed. And they'll come back to the other reforms because it seems to be, okay, we didn't succeed in getting the whole thing through, so salami tactics. So I think he will extricate himself. Maybe he'll simply be able, once the reasonable clause isn't there, he can fire the attorney general and appoint a new one who will say, oh, actually, no reason for this process to go continue. I don't agree with you on the issue of the left actually creating the problem by boycotting Netanyahu. That's sort of, I think, reversing causality. The position was, we have a prime minister who is under indictment. One cannot be prime minister while under 3 serious indictments. And I think...
Except that you can.
Well,
because he is.
The fact is...
You can't be a minister, but you can be a prime minister.
No, of course. Legally, of course. You're right. Mm-hmm. That's some sort of quirk of the laws, mm-hmm. because no one ever saw the possibility that a prime minister would be under indictment. Ministers, yes. I'm not talking legally. I'm talking in terms of real world politics and just basic justification. And I think we've seen it because the country has now gone through a half a year of torture, I believe, because of the indictments. And I believe that they've played a role in the decision to respond to a significant Hamas, or actually PIJ attack back in April, and the operation that took place last week in Jenin, both of which were, I believe, justified in terms of counterterrorism. Okay, Palestinian Islamic Jihad was firing at us, and any government would have had to respond to that. And what we've seen in the last few months, maybe half year, is a rise in terrorism in the West Bank, and it's become very ugly, and hardly a day goes by without an attack, and very often people being wounded and killed. Again, any government might have responded in these cases. I have little doubt that Netanyahu's electoral/legal considerations played a very important part in this, in the decisions to launch, in a decision to launch these two operations. I'm saying justified, and any government might have done it. In this case, there were additional considerations that were particular to Netanyahu that would not have been there had there been a different prime minister.
So let's segue into that operation. But just before we do, a couple of very, very quick points. Number one, regardless of the outcome, I do not want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu in jail. I think that even if he were to be found guilty of all charges, which I think is very, very unlikely, but even if he were to be found guilty of all charges, I think that he should be spared any prison time. I do not think that it's helpful to the body politic of the state of Israel. I don't think that this is an endless pulsing celebration that we have to have of showing that our highest dignitaries and leaders can indeed be sent to jail and that nobody's above the law. And I would like to see Israel follow the example of Gerald Ford with regard to Richard Nixon and let the country heal in the event that that happens. But I emphasize, I don't think that that will happen. I don't think that will be the fate of Bibi Netanyahu. The second thing that I will say is I do believe that the center and center-left parties bear a great deal of responsibility for this. Incidentally, it may be why the protest movement has not actually empowered them as their leaders or official representatives. Maybe they're dissatisfied with the way in which they've acted as opposition members. And the third thing that I will say about it is I just don't know. I don't want to believe or think that Operation House and Garden, which was the operation you're referring to in Jenin, was brought about in order to get Netanyahu a bump in the polls. But I will just tell you, with all that's going on with the judicial reform, one doesn't want to have a prime minister under indictment. I understand that. Legally, it can happen. It is happening. And anybody who says that it can't happen is not in touch with the facts on the ground. But I also don't want a situation where an elected official can be hounded out of office by way of cases being brought against him by the judiciary. That has to be guarded against as well. So it seems to me that there needs to be a biting point here, and I don't think Israel struck it correctly at all. One last point on the opposition and the demonstrators against the judicial reform. I want to ask you a quick question, then we'll move to what we said, the operation in Jenin. Do you think they're in danger of losing public sympathy? Are they going too far with the demonstrations? Do you think that they're going to start to fall on deaf ears as they continue the tactics, ratchet them up, and increasingly inconvenience the general population?
First of all, I don't know the answer to that. We'll wait and see. And I think that the leaders of the protest movement are cognizant of the problem, and so they're weighing their options continually. There's no doubt that the disruptions, well, they inconvenience all of us. Okay, I couldn't get to work last week or earlier this week, and I'm a supporter of the. Okay, so it inconveniences everyone, and obviously the people who disagree feel particularly inconvenienced and furious. I would say actually, people who've been caught in traffic jams, understandably, are furious. How do you conduct effective grassroots opposition without causing some disruption? It's not just enough. I think the primary means, and that's what's been done, is demonstrations. But in the end, the demonstrations sort of become background noise if you don't do something that gains attention, that causes inconvenience. And you can try and do some positive things, I mean, you wrap yourself in the flag as the protest movement has done, and you can carry floats and all sorts of things. In the end, I don't know. I haven't thought of any better ideas in any event. I recognize it's problematic, and what you're saying could happen. I don't think we're there yet. But let's go to the
Yeah,
operation in Jenin, the biggest operation the IDF has conducted in the West Bank since 2002, since Chomat Magen, defensive wall, I believe it was
shield,
called.
defensive shield.
Defensive shield, correct. So the biggest operation in two years. On the other hand, it was limited to 2 days. It was limited to begin with. I don't know if they knew that it would be exactly 2 days, but they were thinking in that kind of time frame. Now, as I was saying, there were a couple of attacks, a whole bunch of attacks actually in the weeks that preceded it. And from that point of view, it was certainly a justified operation. I mean, there's a difference between justified and necessary, but a legitimate case to be made for conducting the operation. The real question when you do all of these things is, well, how effective will it be? Is it going to change the situation? Was it worth doing? And by the way, we lost 2 guys. One apparently, particularly tragically, to friendly fire. But that's always a price you may have to pay when you conduct military operations. I don't think this is going to change very much of anything. The Army's goals were quite limited. They said from the outset, we're not trying to change the overall situation. We're not even trying to buy a lot of time or greatly strengthen Israeli deterrence. Basically, what we want to do is create a situation where we can go in more easily to Jenin in the future because we assume we'll have to. And so we've taken down the infrastructure, the various positions that the Palestinians had, which make it hard to go in. They'll rebuild these things. It'll be a little bit easier next time. Gallant, the defense minister himself, has said that he believes a number of more operations may be required. So what did we achieve? Not a great deal. Rockets were fired at Israel for the first time in decades from the West Bank during the operation and in the weeks since the operation. There were a number, I think it was actually 2 terrorist attacks launched against Israel during the operation. The real issue here is, yeah, okay, we're playing tactics, and that's fine. We have to deal with the terrorist threat. The real problem is, what are we doing, or what's our game plan for the future of the West Bank?
Now, just before I reply, Chuck, can you just move your screen a couple of inches lower just for the purposes of the recording? It's just, I know you've got the plug socket there, but it's an elegant set of plug sockets. So we'll tolerate
it's all right.
In order to have you in there. Much better, much
Okay.
better. So let me just lob a direct question at you. What do you want us to do in Judea and Samaria?
I want us to recreate, maintain a situation in which we can separate from the Palestinians. Look, I have no problem. I actually agree with a lot of the right wing's security-related contentions or arguments regarding the West Bank issue. I have a big problem when people allow their ideological feelings to get in the way of their practical real-world policy. Look, we've been in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, for 57 years now. I have yet to hear, and on this I know we disagree, I have yet to hear a realistic solution to the issue, and it's not just West Bank, Gaza as well, to the Palestinian issue, that does not require separation of the 2 peoples. Just by the way, go back to 1936-37, the British who had gotten the mandate, oh, by the way, here, of course, there's another accent in the conversation which might be identified. I admit to my New York accent. Going back to 36-7, there was the famous Peel Commission. The British who had gotten the mandate just in 1920 they didn't know what to do. They established the Peel Commission, and they recommend dividing, partitioning mandatory Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, separating the peoples. Fast forward 1947, the UN partition plan, again, partition, separating the two people. And I don't think anything significant or fundamental has changed since then. We have to separate. If we want to maintain a predominantly Jewish, overwhelmingly or completely democratic Israel, we have to separate from the Palestinians. Now, I, for a long time, thought that was through two states. I still see no viable alternative to that. And you say, well, what should we do for the meantime? Because I do not think that if we had an ultra left-wing party in power tomorrow, the Palestinians would be any more capable of saying yes than they have been in the past. So we couldn't reach a deal for the foreseeable future. But we should not be creating by our own hand a situation which prevents separation in the future.
So I will come to that point, and I appreciate you answering it so directly. I really do. I just want to talk a little bit about the military operation there, House and Garden, as it was dubbed by the Israeli defense establishment. And I want to bring in, for reference, our very good friend Yair Golan. Yair, for our listeners, is the former Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces. He then ran for election in the Knesset. He won election in the Knesset. He's somebody who describes himself, and his party slogan indeed was Jewish, proud, and left. He's somebody aligned with the very far fringes of the mainstream left within the state of Israel. I think he's still well within the pale, but he's on the far left, and he would say that he's on the far left when it comes to that. But Yair made mention of a couple of points that are interesting and distinguish this operation from prior operations, including the raids and operations that he would command back in 2005 when he was commander of that specific division of the Israel Defense Forces. Number one, the commencement of this operation by way of strikes from UAVs, very, very significant. I'd like to know if you have any perspective that you'd like to lend to the conversation about that. Number two, the commitment of exclusively, as I understand it, when it came to the fighting at least, special forces operatives of the Israel Defense Forces, not the regulars, if I can use that term, and I don't mean that term in any way in a derogatory sense. I think that they're all wonderful servants of the security of the state of Israel. And the third aspect that was rather unique was the fact that only combatants, you mentioned the two who fell on our side, but only combatants on the other side were killed and eliminated. So by that we learn no collateral damage, no civilians killed in the conflict. What do you think about those 3 points?
Look, I think what we saw here is that even when we are ostensibly almost in complete control of the West Bank, we're not. And we had to launch what is the biggest operation in 20 years. We had arguably to use UAVs in the territory that we control. We had to use special forces because the regulars weren't enough. And by the way, the special forces should be doing what they're supposed to do in life, which is all sorts of special things. And here I believe that they are wasted on or misused for secondary purposes. They should be training for the very, very special things that they're supposed to be doing. And yes, in this case, 0 civilians killed. Remarkable. The IDF pretty much always goes to extreme lengths to prevent civilian casualties. There's no other military in the world that does what the IDF does. I qualified that a minute ago by saying pretty much because there are always some exceptions in life, and sometimes military exigencies require some ugly things. And here and there have been officers who may have exceeded their authority, but we're talking very, very few exceptions. I know a couple of years ago, there was an international group of military experts, including former ministers of defense from the UK, the US, and a whole variety of countries, former chiefs of staff, who actually complained, so to speak, that Israel was setting too high a bar that other countries wouldn't be able to.
Yes.
So from that point of view, I once again take my hat off to Tzahal, to the IDF. But what I think happened here is this is another case, not the operation that was conducted, but the pressure that led to it from the right beforehand was another case of right-wing overreach, in the sense that the right was pushing for a much bigger operation. They wanted a second defensive shield. There was no need for that. The IDF resisted doing so. They found, I think, much to their frustration, that they couldn't do it because both the domestic and international situation wouldn't let them, and they were forced to at least somewhat conform with realities. Amazingly or surprisingly, after the operation ends, just the following week, the cabinet decisions decides to, quote unquote, save the Palestinian Authority from collapse, the very same Palestinian Authority that the right wing has been calling to disband, dismantle, calling for its collapse for months.
Well, those two ministers dissented, right? Ben-Gvir dissented from the decision, as did Smotrich as well.
But
no
yes,
surprise, but it's
fine. But the Likud has become a hardline right party, and the interesting thing, just before I let you respond, is most of the ministers making the decisions about military operations today have not served and come from parties that object to military service.
You have a problem with that, just theoretically. I
Yeah.
have a huge problem with that, but I'd like to know your perspective. I'm sorry that we're going to digress for a moment, because in many countries, for example, the country in which I grew up, right, it's very, very typical for the Secretary of Defense or the Minister of Defense to not come from a military background. We're different here in Israel, of course, but I'd like to know why you raised that point. That's not something that I anticipated you bringing into the conversation. Just talk about that for a moment, because I find it very interesting, and I don't think it's understood by an international listenership necessarily, because of what I just described in the United Kingdom, and certainly, the United States as well. You remember, one of the areas I always remember, Chuck, because I studied it, was this tension between the generals and McNamara, right, during the Vietnam era and everything that was going on there, and the idea that this man was a number cruncher, was a mathematical genius, was a brilliant individual, knew nothing about the military. How could he? Because he'd never served. Tell me a little bit more about what you just proffered there.
Okay. I'm differentiating between whether a minister has to be a former officer or defense official, and in the state of Israel, where things are different, and just having done military service like everyone is supposed to do under law. I actually think we've had a few ministers of defense in the last couple of decades who did not have a military background and who were very good defense ministers. Moshe Arens. Okay, well, he actually, he'd been in air defense and IAI, the Israel Aerospace Industries, so he knew a lot about military affairs. We also had the Minister of Defense, what's his name, under Olmert, the former head of Histadrut, Amir Peretz, right, who was forced out of office because he overall was not a good defense minister, I believe, but he made one excellent decision. He forced the IDF to accept the Iron Dome program, which at the time the IDF did not support. It wanted to put all of its budgets into offensive and not defensive capabilities, and I think history has proven him right. So the defense minister, other central ministers do not have to be military experts. I believe that it is an outrage in the state of Israel. It is morally unacceptable for anyone who, unless fundamentally unsuited, somebody has a physical disability or mental disability, not to serve, at least the Jewish population. We have decided, and I think correctly, to exempt the military, the Arab sector from compulsive military service. I think today there are areas where we can open it up, and there are a few Arab volunteers, but we can open up to more. We can find areas where the potential secrecy, security aspects are not problematic, and part of the Arab public could serve as well. But certainly the Jewish population, and by the way, those ministers I said who haven't served, they're also not Zionists, many of them. Okay, I don't think anybody who is not a Zionist, certainly among the Jewish population, should be in the government to begin with. But certainly to have these people making life and death decisions when they refuse to allow their children to serve, they object to it. They claim that studying Torah in a yeshiva or a kollel is equivalent to military service. This is nonsense. These people are draft evaders who use their political clout to evade the draft and are now trying to force through another legal reform, which will make this draft dodging legal.
Well, I appreciate you talking about that. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I wanted our listeners to hear why it is that you're of the mindset that whomever is overseeing military operations in the state of Israel ought to have, I think it's fair to describe your view as, they ought to have a military background or some military experience. At what level?
Just compulsory service.
Just compulsory service. Right. And I agree with you on that. I think that you're correct. I share your position on that. I don't know that it's necessarily understood among our listeners, but I'm glad that you expressed that. With regard to Judea and Samaria and where we would be, I think that you used the term viable alternatives. I don't think that the two-state solution is viable. I never thought that it was. I think that it's nonsense on its face. I don't think that it can be implemented. I think that were it to be attempted to be implemented, it would tear apart Israeli society in an irreparable fashion. I think that it is a surrender to the pressures of the international community when it comes to our right to be in our ancestral homeland here in the state of Israel. And I also think that we don't have a partner on the other side, but I actually celebrate that because I fear what would occur were there to be a pragmatic, jaded, but pragmatic partner from the Palestinian arena who raised his head and said, I will implement the two-state solution from the Palestinian perspective. By the way, no such person exists because there are at least two polities at play. There is no one voice that can speak for the Palestinian people. But were that person to come to the fore, the state of Israel would quickly be exposed as being unable to implement it from our side. And I think that the state of Israel must put forward a policy position that is implementable at the point of it being required to be implemented. And if it is rejected, is sufficiently tempting and sufficiently virtuous that it's very, very clear to the international community who is the party of no in the case that the policy position is refused or rebuffed. And I think we're a long way from there. But the fear that I have, Chuck, the fear that I have is that I believe that the momentum that is gathering behind international calls, including from among our allies, for Israel to enter into a one-state reality with the Palestinian Arabs, I think that momentum is increasing. And I think that the pendulum that swings towards that position from countries overseas with regard to the state of Israel, I think that pendulum is gaining momentum. I think that it's gaining speed. I think it's gaining velocity. And I think that if the state of Israel does not put something on the table that cuts that momentum, stops it dead, I think that we are sleepwalking into a very, very precarious situation indeed. But of course, you know my view on this. We don't have to discuss this at length. I think that any policy position that is put forward by the government of the State of Israel must not be predicated upon the ceding of any land whatsoever. That's the first thing. It must not be predicated upon the ceding of any land whatsoever. And furthermore, I think that it needs to be put forward as a clear political outcome that is likely to be preceded by a fierce military engagement. And what I'm referring to there is specifically against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also, as we've seen from this operation, which is not a war, but an operation, House and Garden, against those terror cells and terror networks that exist in Judea and Samaria. One last quick point about this, because I think you raised a very, very interesting point that I hadn't thought about, which was the capabilities of the Special Forces unit that was sent forward there in Judea and Samaria during Operation House and Garden. And you said that they're being wasted. They should be training for really high-level stuff, for example, going and detonating targets in Iran and so on and so forth. I firmly believe that the Israel Defense Forces writ large is being wasted in Judea and Samaria, and they should not be there. I think that what we ought to be doing is massively bolstering the numbers of police. I think that much of the work in Judea and Samaria is police work. It is not the work of the military. I think our forces are not training for war fighting, because they are doing the business of police work. And I think something needs to be adjusted there pretty dramatically. I spent many months in Judea and Samaria in full uniform as a soldier of the Israel Defense Forces. There were times when we were conducting ambushes. There were times when we were conducting arrests. All of that occurred. But there were many times when we were just undertaking police work, civilian level police work, incidentally, in terms of its complexity and in terms of its skill level. And I will tell you quite frankly, we weren't trained for that. We didn't know how to undertake police work in Judea and Samaria, but there we were standing there with our M16s, and I think that that needs to be adjusted. So just some food for thought there. And maybe we've got time for one more topic, Chuck. You can either come to me about anything I've just said, or maybe you want to talk about the business of war fighting and talk a little bit about Hezbollah or Iran or anything else that's on your mind. We just have, I'm afraid I can only stay for one more topic at the moment.
So the question, well, let me press you a little bit on a couple of things, and let me preface that with a couple of comments. First of all, let me just note, you used the term Judea and Samaria, I used the term West Bank. Yeah. That's not because I don't recognize our ancestral homeland, our ancestral heritage. If you are a Zionist and believe in the existence of a Jewish state, I think it would be total blindness not to remember, to recognize that the biblical story took place largely in what we today call Judea and Samaria. There was no Tel Aviv or Haifa. The problem is that when people start using terminology or names, they become committed to them and to what stands behind them. So I recognize the historical affinity. I do not see how we deal with 3 million people living in Judea and Samaria today, Palestinians, if we don't separate. Now, you may very well be right that we can't reach a two-state solution. That means, to my way of thinking, that we have to find some other way to separate. I don't know how you do that. And I don't know how you do that without ceding any land if you want this arrangement, whatever it is, to be somehow acceptable to the Palestinians. I'm glad we agree on the fact that IDF forces are being wasted in the West Bank. You point out international pressure to reach the two-state solution and the international pressure which is pushing us into the one-state solution. First of all, I don't believe that by, let's say, acceding to international demands, we're doing anybody a favor. We're doing ourselves a favor if we resolve the issue one way or another. It's our problem. It's not really theirs. But the entire world, pretty much with the exception of the state of Israel today, and Iran, which doesn't accept our existence at all, but the US, Europe, the entire Western world, Russia, China, the Arab world, with just a few exceptions, all support the idea of a two-state solution. We used to, some of our governments, many of the public still do. There's no one out there willing to talk about an alternative, unless we're talking about a one-state solution, but the one-state solution that the other side is talking about is a Palestinian majority state, which will very rapidly cease to be a democracy and a Jewish state. It will become another Arab state. And there are people on our side who are talking about what's a one-state solution, which will be we won't have a majority for very long, but it'll be under our control, and it won't be a true democracy. Why do you believe that there's no chance to even find a Palestinian partner, at least down the line? Why do you believe that if we could reach a two-state solution, that we can't implement it? There is a government in the state of Israel. It carries out the laws. Sometimes they're unpopular. Why can't you said it's irreversible? It will render society apart irreversibly. Why?
Well, I'll answer that in a moment, and I will. Please remind me to answer it if I don't at the end of some of the comments I want to make. First of all too easy for the international community to get behind an alliterative title and say this is what the state of Israel needs to do. They will not have to live with its consequences should it go bad, and I believe that it will go bad. That's the first point. Now, I, together with the Miryam Institute and my colleague Rosita and the team, and you've spoken to these groups, I bring delegations to the state of Israel. These delegations to the state of Israel come from some of the preeminent academies in the world, including the military academies. I bring active officers of the United States Army to the state of Israel. These are individuals who know a thing or two about security and safeguarding the homeland and so on and so forth. I am telling anybody who's willing to listen with absolute authority, it is next to impossible for an American who has not come here, spent time here, and seen the geography at play here to have any understanding whatsoever about the precarious situation in which the state of Israel is now and the tenfold degree of precariousness that it would be in the event of the implementation of a two-state solution. So firstly, international community, they said, far too easy for them to trumpet a position with which they will not have to live. And by the way, a basic tenet of Zionism is we decide our own destiny. We don't ask other people to impose a destiny upon us. Secondly, having lectured at hundreds, as you have as well, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of venues throughout the United States of America, the people who are pro-Israel and support the two-state solution, I want to re-emphasize that, pro-Israel and support the two-state solution, when you ask them to describe what is entailed within that policy position, they know not of what they speak, and they decline the invitation to please outline it in the broadest possible terms.
Explain that. I don't understand that.
Because they do not know what the two-state solution actually requires. They do not know what is required to implement it. What they know is the alliterative title, two-state solution. They then know the rubric, two states for two peoples living side by side in peace and security. And they feel all warm and fuzzy inside as a result of that, because it sounds absolutely wonderful and eminently doable. The problem is when you ask these individuals who have and I'm only focusing on those who care for the state of Israel. I'm not going to talk about those who have pernicious intentions for the state of Israel, only those who care for the state of Israel. You ask them to come to the front and draw out the basic parameters of the two-state solution, or list in basic forms some of the steps that would have to be undertaken in order to implement the two-state solution. They simply do not know any of those steps. They know nothing of those parameters. And so when the international community, friend or foe, says, well, we're behind the two-state solution, I question how much they actually know about the policy that they are espousing. Now, the other thing that I will say about it is that we started this conversation talking about judicial reform. We started this conversation talking about individuals who serve in the Israel Defense Forces who are banding together to say that they are not going to serve because they don't like the direction of the government, right? In basic terms, they don't like the direction in which the government is going, and therefore they are not going to report to the line, proverbially, or in many of these cases to the keyboard, right? They're not going to do it. Well, do you really think that that's not going to be replicated when the government, by the way, in the wake of a completely failed experiment in policy implementation, in my judgment, the unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, when an Israeli government says that they're going to again impose a withdrawal from land in which Israel currently where Israel currently administers that land, if they're going to say they're going to withdraw and they're going to uproot Jews as they do so, by the way, up to approximately some estimates at 250,000, other estimates about 100,000, it's an awful lot of Jewish people, right? In a way that if we saw them doing that in France, for example, if 100,000 Jews were being expelled from where they were living in modern day France right now, we would be in absolute uproar. Does anybody really think that these communities of Jewish people are going to accept that? Does anybody really think that these communities of Jewish people are going to go along and say, maybe they'll get it right this time? I don't think that they will. And by the way, without advocating for anarchy, I don't think that they should be expected to. There is no evidence to suggest that such a policy would meet with a positive outcome. So these are just a few of the reasons why I believe it would rend and tear apart Israeli society to an irreparable extent. I think anybody who wants to drive forward the two-state solution should tread very, very carefully indeed. In fact, just to declare my hand, as you already know, I really think it should be consigned to the dustbin of history. It was a bad idea at the time. It's worse now. It's less implementable now. And with regard to the Palestinian leadership, no such leader exists, and it's not going to take one leader right now, so termed. And I use the word leader in very, very loose terms. It's going to take a leader from Hamas. They're unlikely to do that. And it's going to take a leader from the Palestinian Authority. They don't have any such remit. So I think that we need to start thinking about what we can unilaterally bring about and declare as our end goal. And I think that we need to start thinking, as we say, out of the box. My position, it's not new. My position is to create a state for the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip with contiguity into the Sinai Peninsula. And I think that we should apply to that solution the same standards that we applied to the founding of the State of Israel, which has resulted in a pretty glorious reality. And I think those same standards should be extended over to the Palestinian Arabs. Now, I'm on the right, one would say, on this particular issue, although I know that you bristle at the terms left and right, and I understand why, and I do in many senses, but I still think right and left can broadly be drawn about giving away of land, not giving away of land. I think that's one of the buckets, right, that separate these different positions. I am on the right with that. I am completely opposed to giving away land, but I'm a bit of a strange bird in the horizon of the right, because I believe that there is a people that is the Palestinian Arabs. And I think that those voices say there's no such thing as a Palestinian, they never existed, they don't. Fine. But they're here now. They've organized now. They have the intrigue of the international community now. What are we going to do with this situation? Turning around and saying they don't exist, they're not there, they're not really there, look away, that's not going to remedy this issue. And a final quick point, the reason that I say Judea and Samaria, Chuck, is firstly, I'm informed about that issue from my religious upbringing to this day, although I'm no longer Orthodox. But secondly, I have a horrific and awful memory of giving a lecture at one of the universities in the United States of America, and somebody talking to me, a student talking to me from way back in the auditorium and saying, the West Bank, the West Bank, the West Bank, and I invited him forward to draw on the blackboard where the West Bank was, and he proceeded to draw it on the west coast of the state of Israel. So, you know, geography still matters somewhat, and I don't want people to be too confused by these names. So those are my perspectives on that issue, and we can do a whole show on that, and I think we probably should do. I'm just giving a couple of highlight points.
And I deeply appreciate your doing so. And it's always a pleasure to talk with you about these issues, because we can disagree on a rational level and address points point by point. And too often, true in all countries, but especially in Israel, people start going off on a tangent and they get all emotional about it, and it's hard to hold a rational discussion. I partially agree with you that it's impossible for people abroad to understand Israel's security situation. If you talk about the average person, the average knowledgeable person, maybe even the non-average, the particularly knowledgeable person, you're probably right. But there are experts. During the so-called Kerry Initiative, General Allen, a senior American general, was sent as a defense envoy to try and work out realistic and effective defense arrangements, security arrangements with the IDF for a potential solution. And I believe that they reached broad agreement on that area.
I just want to just a moment on that.
Sure.
First of all, we all know the limitations of generals.
Okay.
We know the limitations of American generals. There are limitations on Israeli generals. Not always do generals know that they have limitations.
Absolutely.
There.
Absolutely.
And I'd rather that they remedied their own security challenges first and then showed us that they're qualified and able to then overlay such remedies onto the Israeli map. I don't think they've done that, but also you may agree with that, and I respect your expertise, and I spoke about your expertise at the top of the program. Moshe Bogi Ya'alon did not agree with that. He was very, very involved with General John Allen. Moshe Ya'alon became our
absolutely right.
Before that, he was our chief of staff. To this day, Moshe Ya'alon will tell you that General John Allen did not know of what he spoke at all, and he won't confirm or deny, but he will tell you that there are rumors about him in a closed room expressing that he felt John Kerry suffered from a degree of messianism when it came to resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So just to give a little bit of counterpoint to your point.
Well, let me just point out that Bogi was also a former general. And so yes, everything you said applies to all generals.
That's a fair point. But he did give an Israeli perspective with greater immediacy of the outcome.
He did. Look, you used the term expulsion. If there's a two-state solution, expulsion of a large Jewish population, whatever the number is in the end, one can call it an expulsion. One can say that a number of Israeli citizens, whatever it is, are being asked to move at most a few miles. Most of them will be able to continue in the jobs that they have today. Some of their children will have to go to new schools, many of them. It's not really a big deal if you don't oppose it ideologically. It'll be a big deal financially. It shouldn't be. It's only an expulsion if you want to define it in those terms. I moved 6,000 miles from the United States. You moved a couple of thousand miles from Britain, and somehow we did not feel that this was forced expulsion. I think you're right that if and when this happens, tear apart Israeli society is a strong term, but you're absolutely right to point out that there will be very, very strong opposition to this, understandable opposition. And when I was saying before that I share your fear that what's happening now, the opposition to military service, is a precedent for the future, that's exactly what I had in mind. So yes, it's definitely the refusal or the opposition to service today is a very dangerous precedent for the future, first and foremost for that scenario. To my way of thinking, the only realistic alternative to a two-state solution is a one-state solution, and I believe that that's what's happening. And for me, a one-state solution means a binational solution. Binational states, I think, are invariably a catastrophe. Certainly in the Middle Eastern context, look no farther than our neighbors in Syria and Iraq. If that's what we want to become, unilaterally, yeah, maybe we should unilaterally say, this is the border we're willing to, I would say, withdraw to. And Palestinians can accept it or not accept it. It means withdrawing from most of the territory, at least on a civil basis, but Tzahal can remain deployed in other areas for security reasons. We're going to rend our society apart in any event. So better that we do it by our own decisions rather than being forced into things by a reality that we can't control. And I think you should respond, and then we should wind it up because we've spoken at length.
Absolutely. So first of all, on the point of binational states, I'm not in favor of a binational state. It's part of the reason that I put forward an alternative. Incidentally, I want to tell you that I personally was engaged in a series of meetings up to and including at the level of the administration, the previous administration of the United States. By the way, I would have done the same for a democratic administration. I wasn't asked to do so. I was asked to do so in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an appetite for alternatives to the two-state solution. It's incorrect for anybody to presume that everybody and anybody is locked into the two-state solution as it's commonly understood, only to the two-state solution and forever to the two-state solution. Not correct in my experience, and I believe that the appetite for that is merely increasing. Is there an alternative? Given that the implementation of the two-state solution, in my opinion, thankfully, is not a truly viable prospect. The second, and then that's why I've put an alternative to a binational state. I fear for a binational reality coming about, but I believe that there are ways of conjuring with this that we can bring about Israel's long-term security, independence, and sovereignty. We can provide the very same for the Palestinian Arabs, and the state of Israel does not have to give away land, certainly not land that is central to its character and identity and its origin story as the one and only Jewish state. Secondly, I profoundly disagree with your characterization of people being removed from their homes. I believe it is an expulsion. I believe it was an expulsion then, and I believe that the results and the trauma that eventuated from that expulsion, those wounds are still very much open. Now, if I willingly say I'm going to move to the state of Israel from the United Kingdom and cross an ocean to do so, of course, nobody's expelling me from that, from the United Kingdom. There is no trauma. There's only the joy of arriving to build one's home in the state of Israel. But if I had found myself in a situation where the government of the day in the United Kingdom had said, you and your family are no longer welcome, you are out of here, then to the very same point of arrival, namely the state of Israel, I would have arrived having been expelled. It's not just an issue of semantics, it's an issue of experience. It's an issue of the fact that the people who were expelled from their homes were never provided with adequate housing thereafter. Many of them were never provided with jobs. Many of them, as you know, earned their livelihood and their livings on the land which they inhabited, and built their financial viability as a result of this. They couldn't simply move to Tel Aviv and open a farm or establish greenhouses or create the communities that they'd created legitimately over there in Gush Katif. And I think that if one is going to communicate with those who live in Judea and Samaria today for ideological reasons, because there are many, many thousands who live in Judea and Samaria, nothing to do with ideological reasons, right? Simply because it's more economically viable for them to do so. They get more money, more bang for their buck. But if one is going to effectively communicate with those who live in Judea and Samaria, I think one would do well to understand the trauma and the scarring that has bound around their hearts and their minds in the wake of the expulsion of the Jewish communities in the Gaza Strip. And I urge people to understand the difference in scale. With regard to the Gaza Strip, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about 15,000, maybe 12,000, 12 to 15,000. What was the number, Chuck?
8,000.
8,000, thank you. So I thought it was higher than that, but let's say it's 8,000. This merely underscores my point further. You're not talking about 8,000 people. You're talking about a minimum of 100,000 people, right?
More,
and as
probably
said,
more.
And some estimates go up to 250,000. That is an enormous number of Jewish people who, by the way, have committed no crime. They've committed no crime. They are living there in Judea and Samaria, building up their homes, building up their communities, building up their families. I'm not talking about people who are running around, with no regard for law and so on. I'm talking about the vast, vast, vast preponderance of people who live there. They are salt of the earth, and no, they should not be expelled, as the communities from Gush Katif, in my estimation, were. That's what I believe happened, and I think that needs to be better understood by everyone. I can tell you just on a very personal note, and then I'll conclude. I used to travel with bodyguards when I would speak on the university campuses. And I would bring one from the Shayetet, which is the equivalent of the Navy SEALs here in Israel, and I would bring one from Shaldag, which was the Air Force Commandos, in approximate terms. I brought a fellow who was an officer in the Shayetet, in the Israeli naval commandos. And as I got to know this fellow, he was born and raised in Gush Katif. His family had been expelled from Gush Katif. That individual, it was quite clear to me, was a displaced person. And he carried himself as a displaced person, and he was severely traumatized. And he came to a point of decision making where he had to determine, is he going to go into the Israel Defense Forces, or is he going to rebel against that, given that the state of Israel just removed him from his home and his family from his home? Ultimately, he made the decision that not only would he serve, but he would serve to the very best of his abilities, and became an officer in the Israeli Navy commandos. But he was traumatized, and he struggled to find his way in the world, and I'm not convinced that he's ever managed to do so. So not only do I know the theory of this, I've also come into contact with these individuals, and I think people should pay close attention to what befell them after they were forced out of their homes. But I think we're probably going to have to wrap, unfortunately, Chuck, because we've taken a very long time to talk about very important subjects. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
It's been great.
I'm looking forward to doing it again. And any final comments from you?
Well, I think you set up enough areas of disagreement in your final comments for next time, so I will refrain from responding now. And I too have enjoyed this very much and look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks, Chuck. And just an appeal to everybody, you can still email us. We'll put the email address in the show notes. Please do subscribe to the podcast. Please do give it a rating review wherever you download your podcast from. It's the IDDF, or Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, here with me, Benjamin Anthony, and with Chuck Freilich, our host here. I've had the pleasure of being his guest. I look forward to doing so in the future. And from me, for now, it's over and out. Thank you very much.
See you next time.